Greetings all, and welcome to the first video with the new camera you guys have funded, in 4K no less. The January 2020 Q&A. A little delayed, I spent a full week going to and coming back from Sweden, Arsenal and Museum, filming a number of vehicles there. So a thank you to those who provided the financial support through Patreon, Subscribestar or PayPal. A couple of glitches overseas, first time out with new equipment, but I think you'll find what comes out of it interesting and informative. Probably look for that around March. Anyway, to the questions. Quite a few opinion questions, not many objective ones. I'm not quite sure this was really what I had in mind when I started the Q&A series, but whatever. Let's tackle it. And starting off with horizontal volutes question of how would American armor have done against T-3485s and IS-2s if some hypothetical scenario came about like Operation Unthinkable, which basically puts the Western Allies versus the Soviet Union immediately after World War II? Well, the only thing close we can really look to is the events of the Korean War, which definitely fell in the US's favor, and the 1956 war, which was perhaps a little bit more even in terms of tanks, but it still came out very much in favor of the Israelis. But then there is something to be said for the quality of the crews at the time. Well, now, first of all, of course, it's not American armor versus Soviet armor. It's the Western Allies against the Soviet army. None of whom are particularly happy at the concept of continuing on, not least because everybody's looking at Japan in the short term. But for the purposes of the question, let's assume that things get nasty in June, because after September, A-bombs start dropping. The first thing that happens is that the Allies stop Lend-Lease supplies. This won't have an immediate effect on the Soviet warfighting ability, but when over half the Red Army's fuel and about 2/3 of the materials used to make explosives, kind of important in warfare, see their supplies run out, some serious rejiggering of the Soviet war machine, is going to be needed and will have some repercussions at the pointy end. The good news for the Allies is that, by and large, the equipment still being used is of the World War II era. So Pershings are present only in small numbers. A similar amount, if that, of T-44s might show up. A couple of Centurions might be involved and a similarly small amount of IS-3s, but that's really it. Oh, and if you're an Allied tanker, try not to get on the wrong end of an ISU-152. On the plus side, for the Americans, a month's pause in the fighting will have permitted delivery of a higher proportion of 76mm HVSS tanks, and every 76 tank and 3-inch tank destroyer should have a couple of HVAP rounds handy for at least having a reasonable chance to kill the IS-2s, certainly from the side. The 90mm would similarly have a more reasonable number of T-33 and HVAP available as well, and would able to be capable of reliably dealing with the IS-2s. Now, of course, they will be receiving, at the very least, 85mm fire coming back the other way. And most anything which connects is going to be a problem, not least for the Cromwells. The Churchills could mount a nasty surprise, however, and even their 75mm ought to be plenty enough to deal with the T-3485. Sure, the armor is well sloped, but the bottom line, it's only 45mm thick. Turret fronts could be an issue, though. Overall, it comes down to who gets the first shot on whom first, and though I'd give it to the Sherman, the difference isn't really by very much. Su-100s would be a threat to anything, and when it comes to the IS-2 or ISU-152, then it basically comes down to a repeat of dealing with Panthers and Jagdpanzers, with the differences being that the Soviet vehicles are a little bit more consistent than the German ones. But the troops and commanders are perhaps slightly less flexible and responsive. Soviet artillery was known for its incredible volume and weighted barrage, but nobody could respond as quickly as a US squad leader could call down accurate fire with his radio. On the other hand, frontal aviation would have a rather large number of ground attack aircraft like IL-2s, and the Allied air defense folks would probably be a bit rusty due to not having had much practice over the course of the previous year. Thus, overall, it seems to me as pure speculation that the initial fighting would have at best held the front line and more likely would have resulted in Soviet penetrations and a requirement to fall back, maybe even as far as the French border. At the tanker level, the Western Allies likely would be giving more than they were taking, but they'd have to fall back. After 3 years of it, the Soviets will have known how to mount a proper deliberate attack by now, and I'm not sure the Western Allies would have been able to bring the fight to the Soviets as well as they could against the Germans. But then the logistical matters would start to hit. The USSR did not suffer much from a strategic bombing campaign during the war, and marshalling yards, for example, insofar as they still existed in eastern Germany, would likely be unprepared for the results. The Studebakers would keep running for a while, bringing supplies forward, but no more spare parts would mean cannibalizing would become more common. Then the shortages start for the fuel and ammunition. The troops start to go hungry as the supplies from Canada and the US no longer would be coming. The Soviet ability to assault would peter out. And then will come the hard slog going the other way. Or Kiev, Minsk, or Vladivostok would receive an A-bomb. Admiral Tiberius. Name my top 5 tank destroyers of World War II, based on performance in the field and numbers built. And he apparently likes Nashorn. Okay. Number 5, Ferdinand. And yes, it's a controversial one. After all, it's based on that ridiculous electric drive system. However, if you consider that as a TD, it's likely driving a little less than a tank. And I suspect that at least some of the problems of cooling and maintenance would be redressed by not needing to leave the room for a turret in the middle. It seems to have performed at least acceptably. Plus, there is an inherent mobility in an electric drive vehicle which a TD could find useful. As Hilary Doyle observes, when used properly, it performed very well indeed. Look at the capability you're getting in 1943 as well. I mean, sure, by early 45 better vehicles are out there, but that's nearly 2 years later.
Well, a German vehicle that gets bad press is the Ferdinand Elephant. Everybody reads about how bad it was, no machine gun for close-in combat and so forth. However, that's completely wrong, because there are 2 different units had that. One was a former Sturmgeschütz unit. They were great. They really did devastation with those vehicles. The other unit was a Panzerjäger lads who were driving around with trucks with Pak 37s. And when they got them, they said they thought they were invulnerable, so they drove around thinking they were invulnerable, and they lost all their vehicles. So it's very much depending on who was using them. The Sturmgeschütz guys knew from 1940, 1941, and so how you stayed quiet, you waited, and you took out the target. You didn't go driving around in this big armoured fortress.
Number 4, Jagdpanther. You want something which can duel it out with a number of enemy tanks to include jumbos and ISs? That's likely your man. Complete with reinforced final drives as compared to those on a regular Panther. Not so stupidly overhuge as the Jagdtiger, but plenty armoured enough to take the hits from most anything, and not so ungodly big as to be unwieldy. But still, it's plenty big enough, and maintenance is still a bit of a pisser. Number 3, SE-100. What a gun. The vehicle had a few notable ergonomic issues, see my video, but it's on a great chassis, it's not too big, and it packs a hell of a punch. Number 2, Panzerjäger 1. Now sometimes people forget that it's there. This vehicle was built to the tank destroyer doctrine postulated by the Germans in the interwar period, and was the first vehicle built in numbers to meet it. User reports indicated that the crews had great confidence in the things. The 4.7cm cannon was good enough that the crews felt that they were able to take on even a Char B1. Certainly, at the time, it was basically the best anti-tank gun on a German vehicle, excepting a few low production types like that self-propelled 88. Number 1, the M10. It's an interim vehicle built to cheap standards and is still turned into the workhorse of the Western Allies. The crews were more than willing to take on tigers, panthers and elephants, and usually ended up on the winning side of those engagements, regardless of what the paper figures said. Vehicles were reliable, easy to keep running, roomy, and with a gun that was viable through to the end of the war, and so some crews flat refused to turn them in for the M18. Mechanical Adept. Which method of track tensioning do you believe to be more effective than the others? What is the service interval you need to retension track? Well, thank you for asking. Finally, somebody asks a good question on my favorite topic. Second question first. The -10 for the M1A1 indicates that track tension is checked after every mission. Although in practice we tended to do it as a before every mission thing. I can see arguments both ways, but the manual is specific. Interestingly, I also looked at the -10 for the M113, and that indicates that track tension is done before each mission. Of course, checking does not necessarily mean that an adjustment is required, but especially on the M1, it is just as easy to simply put a couple of squirts of grease in to see if it pops as it is to do an official measuring assessment. So to the question of how often is it adjusted, as opposed to how often is it checked, that basically comes down to the nature of the day's operation and the age of the track. It could be as often as once a day, it could be once a week or even longer. As to which method is more effective, obviously the engineers have decided that the answer to that is hydraulic, be it either the pressure of the grease in the M1 or fluid in Challenger 2. That seems to be the way to go. There is nothing inherently failing about the older methods, such as the screw type of the locking plate or the ratchet and pawl, but they are a little bit more inconvenient to use. The easiest, well, that goes to the Challenger 2. There's a couple of small levers in the driver's compartment. That's it. The system is basically automated. And it is the envy of all tankers in the civilized world. A side note is to be found in track tensioning idlers on some tanks as the American ones of the late 1940s. Now this idea is sound enough. It's a little extra wheel which always puts pressure on the track, but it was found to be unnecessary and the engineers just got rid of it. Charles Charange. What is the future of cavalry? Does the advent of drones jeopardize their future? Well, not if the cav are the drone operators. But the question is, I think, based off of a false assumption that the sole role of cavalry is scouting. Now, reconnaissance is a traditional role, indeed, for cavalry units, and in some armies it is their only role. If the cavalry only operates small, sneaky vehicles optimized for seeing without being seen, like ferrets or fennecs, the chances are that this is such an army. Perhaps they might, in theory, also be able to provide a counter-reconnaissance role, although this will generally be down to calling artillery fire, airstrikes, or maybe from handheld missile systems like Javelin. If you want to deal with something a little bit more forceful on the opposing side, you need to bring along something with a cannon. If your drone is carrying Hellfires, perhaps it will be used in the counter-recon role as well, at least in good weather, but such a drone is likely to be big enough to get shot down by air defenses pretty quickly. Then there are the economy of force missions. Look up the missions Guard, Cover and Screen. FM 3-90 should work for you for this. These missions are usually given to battalion-sized or bigger cavalry units, their job being to protect the friendly main fighting forces. To give you an idea of what you need, until a few years ago there was no line cavalry unit in the US Army considered capable of carrying out a cover mission. 1st Cav Division is technically accepted, but in reality they're basically just a standard division organization which has kept its flags and hats. The last Armoured Cavalry Regiment went away in 2011. Armoured Cavalry Squadrons had only Bradleys and Humvees, and this was not deemed sufficient for the level of combat required of a cover mission, and in order to do it, it had to be augmented by units from the main body, the Combined Arms Battalions. Finally, a few years ago, somebody had a brainstorm of putting tanks back into the cavalry squadrons, so the cavalry units finally had the organic firepower it needed to conduct all the missions that doctrine said that they could. If you're not capable of conducting your missions with a bunch of 30-ton Bradleys and you need tanks, I don't see how you can perform this mission with a drone system. Similarly, with another traditional function of the cavalry, independent operations or raids. Now, it is certainly true that a line brigade or a battalion can conduct missions such as cover or raids, but this is where I said economy of force. These missions don't necessarily require taking up the entirety of an infantry complement of the Combined Arms Battalions to bring along. Those guys can be better utilized doing something else. Cav units tend to be a little bit short on dismounts. Just enough to do their role and no more. The old 3rd ACR until 2011 was the only unit capable of performing cavalry operations for a corps-sized element, and it did so by having its own, proportionally smaller, amounts of artillery, logistics, aviation and so on support. It was a division in miniature. In a nutshell, a drone is not an all-weather system capable of sitting in a concealed position for days at a time and then engaging the enemy with immediate direct heavy fire when they finally show up. So no, cavalry isn't going anywhere. Even if the US Army has sort of lost the distinction between the cavalry squadrons and the Combined Arms Battalions in a number of cases. Tsubomi Kido wishes to inform me that the device that is replacing the laser countermeasure system on the Chinese Type 99 tank, as is now found on the Type 99A, is in fact just a newer version of the laser countermeasure system. Okay, so be it, I am now informed. Adam Schindler. What does the widespread deployment of guided artillery projectiles do to the role of the tank or AFV on the modern battlefield? To be brutally honest, those things scare the living crap out of me. I view them as the greatest threat to my survivability as a tanker, and I would rather face down the Chinese horde than be on the receiving end of an artillery barrage with these things. Now, there are a couple of types of these guided artillery rounds. There's unitary rounds such as Copperhead or Excalibur. Sucks to be on the receiving end, but at least there's a chance you can identify the designating unit and kill it, and they only kill one tank at a time anyway. The other ones are much scarier. If you haven't heard of it, look up the M898 SATARM rounds. Search and destroy armor. These little buggers are submunitions deployed from the artillery shell in flight where you think the enemy vehicles might be. They then float down on a parachute with a little radar inside, looking for a hard metal return. When they see one within range, they detonate an explosively formed projectile and then punch it through the roof. They were used in the 2003 invasion of Iraq. About 120 rounds fired, claimed 48 vehicles killed after the US troops reached the impact zone. Now that's bad enough until you realize that this is now decades old technology and it's no longer the domain of just the US. The Swedes and French have come up with a better system. It's called Bonus SFM, which the US is now looking at to replace SATARM. This is used by the Swedes, the French, the Finnish and the Norwegians. The Germans have the Smart 155. Generally the same principle, except they use infrared, which also Bonus is. That's used by Switzerland, Greece, UK and Australia. I mean seriously, even the Greeks can afford these? Well, if the Greeks can afford them, it seems to me that the country which considers artillery to be the god of war likely can afford to put some effort into it too. Oh wait, they can. Look up the SPBE sensor fused munition, for example. Still, it could be worse. That's just smart ammunition. The US started to develop the BAT round, brilliant anti-tank, in which the submunitions would talk to each other just to make sure they weren't going to engage the same target. Oh, and they might also be able to undertake evasive maneuvers on the way down. That was, to my knowledge, cancelled some time back, but the idea is out there. It's only a matter of time. So what can you do about this sort of thing? Firstly, increase the roof armor. Compare an STRV-122 roof line to that of an M1, and then hope it's good enough. But you can't really do that for an IFV or a scout vehicle. So your next choice are active defenses. Hope that your anti-missile protection system has good enough arc of fire upwards, and that it's fast enough to hit and deform or otherwise destabilize an EFP coming back the other way. I'm doubtful. Third, pray. If doctrine teaches any other actions to be undertaken when you see little parachutes above your tank, I have not yet been to that class. Alexander H. How much do I know about Battletech and what's my take on the clans? I have a passing familiarity. I mean, I played a few games and there's a lovely little direct port of the Hex-based game that I could play on my laptop a few years back, but that's pretty much the extent of it. I have no opinion on clans, never really having delved down to that level. Andrew Sebastian, having tanked for Sam and been paid at a bonus, what's my opinion on the US Army's retention policy for tankers, especially those who don't want to switch branches? Right, sport. As someone who knows his wear plates, the Army, in its infinite wisdom, let me stay being a tanker. Or at least I was the first to request a transfer to an open spot, so I'm not entirely sure what the process really was for the others. The closest that came for me was, in order to make major, I had to transfer out of the line unit. Many of my colleagues rebranched to where the slots were, in a sustainment brigade. They very well may be lieutenant colonels by now. Personally, I refused to take the sabres off my lapel, and my career choices were far more limited in terms of AOC non-specific positions. I am not a lieutenant colonel now. But that's my choice, really. I don't know what happened to the chaps who were in my old tank company when we were told that we were going to be redesignated as fuel truck drivers. As I said, I jumped ship immediately. I'm told that of the 63 men, one stayed. A few came with me. I'm sure a good few decided to get out. And I don't know what happened to the rest of them. I have my own opinions about the idea that soldiers don't care what job they do as long as they get all the benefits and they don't have to travel too much. Ultimately, though, the needs of the Army are what they are. If you want to stay in, well, they're willing to retrain you. and you never lose, per se, your original MOS. So if you later wish to apply for a tanker position, you can. If you weren't willing to stay in, well, the army doesn't exist for you to have your first choice of career. Commissar Carl has a rather good one. In terms of combat effectiveness, what's better? A roomy 2-man turret or a cramped and poorly laid out 3-man turret? Discount autoloaders. I posed the exact same question myself last week when I was sitting in an L60. More or less contemporaneous with a small 3-man turret such as Matilda 2, but the L60 only had a commander and gunner. Ultimately, after much internal debate with myself, I had to give it to the cramped 3-man turret. It may not be as efficient as a non-cramped 3-man turret, but at least when the bullets are flying, each man has his own job, and importantly, the commander is keeping an eye out on things. And when the vehicle isn't actually in combat, they can sit on the roof or otherwise escape the confining problems of the bad turret. With a 2-man turret, even a good one, you just know that one of the 2 crewmen is going to be looking the wrong way or doing the wrong thing just at that wrong moment in the middle of combat. Now, that said, the difference is far smaller than that between a cramped 2-man and a spacious 1-man turret. It's not even a question, the 2-man wins every time. Follow-on question. Do I think technology would advance so that 2-man crews are feasible? Basically with computers doing the target acquisition and traffic tracking and that sort of thing. And I don't think so. It likely is technically possible, but I can't really imagine anybody going to the level of not leaving a man actively in the loop. Ultimately, the driver or commander, and yes, I don't think autonomous driving is anywhere near capable enough for a tank yet, is going to have to distract himself from what he's doing in order to check on what it is that the computer thinks is worth killing. It would take a very desperate army indeed to go tell a machine, yeah, go ahead, kill whatever you want, I'll check on you when I'm done unballsing this radio problem. It will get more interesting when unmanned or undermanned wing tanks start showing up though. The AI could well handle driving, for example, in such a case, given that there is a lead vehicle to follow. And it's possible perhaps that one man in a tank could handle the targeting issues for 2 different vehicles. TN Sheep, as a TC, what feature annoyed me most in the Abrams? And the lack of air conditioning certainly ranks up there. The manual traverse system for the calibre 50 seems to be a great way to remove the skin from your fingers. And it's been fixed now, but giving the driver only an image intensifier proved to be an unanticipated problem. Apparently when they were designing the M1, they didn't think many people would be driving around the battlefield with full headlights on. Of course, that's exactly what folks were doing in Iraq, so you end up with a complete whiteout. This could end up with interesting results. Connor Dodman. What do I think of an armoured caravan that a tank or other vehicle can tow around to use as accommodation to the crews? I love the idea. I can't imagine that the people in charge of procurement would be as happy though, given that they would need to buy the things, maintain the things. I mean, what sort of condition do you think they'll be in after 3 field exercises? And then they'll have to find the manning and equipment for hauling the things. Realistically, the troops can sleep on the tank. And it's quicker for a rapid response anyway, and these things are probably a little bit more difficult to camouflage. Such crew needs can be met by GP mediums, tents, with heaters, field showers and the like. Robert Henry Ilston. As I'm interpreting the root of your question, is there any mechanism for connecting the vehicles in Lager to an external power supply so that they don't need to run the primary engines if an auxiliary generator is not fitted? That certainly can be done. All you would need to do is hook up the external power source to the slave cable connection in the driver's hull. Such power systems can be usually found in museums, on trolleys, with batteries, for example, used for jump starts when the museum pieces of batteries are inevitably a bit low. There is thus no reason why such a system or a portable generator with the correct cables cannot also be used for the same role. That said, I am unaware of any instances where this has actually been done. Just strikes me as one more thing to bring around. Chase walls. If technology allowed us to, and we built an MBT-70 with modern technology, how effective would it be against other MBTs? Cool hypothetical. Basically, MBT-70 was built to push the bounds of 1960s technology. One must wonder though, if you had to push the bounds of 2020 technology, what would a tank look like? I mean, things that the MBT-70 had, hydraulic suspension, gun-launched missiles, and even an auxiliary 20mm cannon are all very well within the realms of what can be done today. The only thing really which hasn't been, and probably with good reason, is the driver and the turret. I mean, honestly, I don't see anything shouting at me that says that an MBT-70 design, just with the technology we have today, such as Type 90 suspension, the HAT missile guidance, or an RWS 20mm, would be of any particular improvement over your standard modern tank. To be a true modern MBT-70, you'd need to incorporate some pretty radical new technologies not normally found on tanks today. Rad W has an interesting one. Do I have any thoughts about equipping future tanks with stereoscopic rangefinders as a backup system, particularly to range targets without alerting them? Now, the reason he's asking is that a lot of vehicles are now coming with laser warning receivers. When they detect that they're being hit by coherent light, they will do anything from just sound an alarm to pop smoke and turn a turret to the threat. Yet, in order to range to a target, lasers are the default system. So the idea of going back in time to an older technology is an interesting one. I'm going to go with no to the answer though, for a few reasons. Firstly, stereoscopic systems take up a good amount of space in the tank. Secondly, as ammunition gets faster, range estimation errors start becoming a little bit less critical. You can estimate range using a choke sight or just calculating with the mil-scale reticle. The third option is to laser point on the ground about the same distance as your target and then lay onto the target. And the fourth option is to simply hope that your ammunition will be able to punch through the target's armor even if it's facing you anyway, although I admit to being perhaps a little bit skeptical of the reliability of that plan. Besides, the difference in time between detection of laser and arrival of saber round is short enough, maybe only a couple of seconds, that it's not going to be enough time for the driver to realize the alarm is screeching, figure out which direction the threat is, and then bring the tank around. So there's a good chance of a flank hit anyway. And if the tank is coming towards you, well, the warning is kind of academic. Andrew Mitchell wants to know how much better might German Ardennes offensive have been had it been equipped with less fuel-hungry tanks with lighter bridging requirements. I don't think it would have mattered. There's no way the Germans were going to get to Antwerp no matter how much more fuel efficient their tanks might have been. Preacher Kane, as we are now in awards season, what would you submit as the Tankie Awards? Specifically, which design feature would make the tank more livable, ergonomic, or effective? There is much to be said for air conditioning. I would trade the boiling vessel in the M1 for a good aircon system. Then again, I spent a lot of time in deserts, and there not being many deserts near Salisbury Plain, I suspect a British tanker may not agree with such a trade. The Aussie refrigerator comes a close second. I'm also a fan of the push-button elevating platform for the TC in Merkava. It makes it very easy to get in and out. The chemical toilet is a nice touch, but since we're no longer trained to be stuck in a tank for 24 hours at a time, that's probably an underappreciated feature these days. As an aside, I was talking with a chap involved in the Swedish tank trials. The one place where the M1 truly beat the hell out of the Leopard, in his opinion, was in the 24-hour closed hatch test. There was enough room in the M1 that folks could move around, stretch their legs as it were. The Leopard 2 was far more confining to the crew. Gaming Sentry, what do I think about the lack of large calibre turreted style systems on LVTs in the US Marine Corps? Betsy's seen as a prototype with a Sheridan turret and 105 gun. And I don't think the lack of it is the end of the world. The only thing that really want a cannon on an amphibious vehicle for these days is the crack a bunker or some such, which doubtless the missiles from marine aviation would be able to deal with if the occasional tank wasn't handy. A 40mm Mark 19 or 30mm cannon ought to suffice quite nicely for pretty much everything else. Patrick Darrington wants to know my opinion on the pros and cons of Conqueror versus M103 since I've been in both. I think I'd have to give the nod to Conqueror, given that the primary purpose of the heavy tank was to put steel on target. The M103 struck me as being perhaps a more mobile vehicle with a better engine, transmission and running gear, but Conqueror had the hunter-killer system with a better designed turret resulting in only the one loader. At least I say it's a better designed turret. Granted, I don't recall that you could set up a couple of hammocks in Conqueror. Let us presume that, reputation aside, the shell ejection system worked as advertised more often than not. Conqueror simply struck me as a vehicle which will put more rounds on target faster and safer for the crew. Purely subjective opinion, of course. If more emphasis were to be placed on maneuver, I'd go with the M103. Now, that's not to say the Conqueror wasn't capable. Bob Griffin was telling me that they could take Conqueror places that Centurion couldn't go. But for long marches, I think the American tank wins there. Andrew Coley, if I'm left-eye dominant, is that a problem for me in the tank as a gunner? Most of the vehicles I've seen are set for right-eyed gunners. Most tanks is actually not much of a problem because you have a brow pad which is slidable one side or the other. You just unscrew it and it slides over. So you were using your dominant eye. I have come across a couple of vehicles which, yeah, it's not an option. One of which you had to be right eye dominant, one of which you had to actually be left eye dominant. What they did was they gave you a blind, so you weren't looking at the right eye. But the vast majority of vehicles I've seen are ambidopticus, or whatever the word might be. PHF has a floaty things question asking why the US didn't deploy aircraft carriers for convoy duty in the Atlantic. They did. They used escort carriers, not fleet carriers. Well, mainly, I think there was a fleet carrier too roaming around. Bottom line though is you didn't really need 60 to 80 aircraft on a 30-knot platform for U-boat searching with a convoy that did 12 knots. Flying Gumba, in a modern vehicle, do you aim for weak points or other specific parts of a vehicle? No. We're trained to aim center mass, the thinking being that any hit will do damage and better to get the definite hit. Now certainly in World War II, specific parts such as the low hull or the track could and would be aimed for when it was considered that the armour was just too thick to penetrate. Finally, one of the most important questions I've ever seen from Andarian. If, by accident, one were to bring an apricot near a tank, what would appease the machine spirit of that tank? And he's asking for a tech priest friend. I'm afraid there are no practical answers. Summary execution may please the machine spirit, but it's somewhat frowned upon by the commissar. Sergeant Major. Generally, it's a case of just giving the offender a right bollocking, regardless of rank differential, and then hoping for the best. Right, now it's time to do a bunch of editing from Sweden. Hooray. If you found it interesting and informative, I'll see you on the next one. Take care.